So I'm going to just have some housekeeping things I'll go on. You guys can start whenever you'd like. Thank you all for coming today. Before we get started, I'd like to give some directions on how we'll proceed today and how to get copies of the report and the other items that you're going to get today. District Attorney Templis will first announce her decision. Chief Thomas will follow with his comments today, and then they'll take a brief amount of time to be able to answer some questions for you guys as well. A media copy of the current report and videos that are ready to be released will be provided to you at no cost at the end of the conference today. Our records manager, Kathy Alcox, will be over at that table over there and will provide you copies of that DVDs before you leave. Just make sure you have your credentials ready for her to be able to check off who she's giving those to. What is being released today is a full report from the Green Bay Police Department and Appleton Police Department at this time. Over 500 pages of documents. As always, we expect some supplemental lab reports and similar documents to continue to filter in over the next few months. There are 2 videos that will be released to you today. They are videos from the body cameras worn by Sergeant Chris Bees and by Officer Christensen. The total duration of those videos is approximately 53 minutes. It takes several hours to redact those videos, and out of desire for quickly releasing this information to the public, we were forced on triaging what we would decide to be able to release to you today and what would best depict what happened that day. Obviously, they're the most important ones from that day, and they're the only officers that were on scene when the incident occurred. We are also releasing over 1,400 pictures and all the audio consisting of radio traffic and 911 calls as well from the incident. Before we get started, we, the Appleton Police Department, the Appleton Fire Department, want to sincerely thank the majority of the media members for doing their job and for informing the public and the community. You've done it with class and professionalism, and we appreciate that. Your compassion for the family and those involved was noticed, and it was very appreciated by us. If everyone is getting ready to start, we will introduce Melinda Templis, District Attorney for Allegheny County. Thank you.
Just give me 1 second. Thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate your patience, as I know we're not starting exactly on time, and I certainly appreciate you waiting patiently. Today I'm here to discuss the tragic events of May 15th at the Appleton Transit Center, and specifically the investigation of the death of Reuben Houston as a result of officer-involved shooting. This was an extremely tragic event that impacted our community, especially the family of Firefighter Mitch Lundgaard, the Appleton Fire and Police Departments, and the officers involved and all of their families. Everyone continues to be in my thoughts and prayers, and I want to extend my deepest condolences to the family of Firefighter Lundgaard, who lost a wonderful husband, father, son, and brother. And I want to send strength and support to Brittany Showalter and Officer Christensen as they continue to heal from their injuries. While officers are trained to fire their weapon and use lethal force to protect themselves and the community, it's a decision they hope that they never ever have to make. Incidents like these have a great impact on the officers, their families, and other first responders who are on the scene. The question that must be addressed in determining whether criminal charges against the officers are appropriate is not whether they were right and correct in their beliefs, but rather whether their actions were objectively reasonable and justifiable under Wisconsin law. In assessing the circumstances, there's no question that Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen of the Appleton Police Department intended to shoot Reuben Houston. I also conclude the evidence demonstrates that when officers fired their weapons, they believed that Mr. Houston was engaged in behavior that threatened the lives of themselves, the firefighters, the paramedics, and citizens in the area of the transit center. Anytime law enforcement officers use deadly force, it's critical to have a thorough, objective, and transparent investigation conducted in order to maintain the integrity of law enforcement and the community's confidence in the result of the investigation. Pursuant to Wisconsin Statute 175.47, the Green Bay Police Department was assigned to investigate this case. Lieutenant Ben Allen was assigned as the lead investigator with assistance from officers from the Green Bay Police Department, the Wisconsin State Patrol, the Department of Criminal Investigations, and the Outagamie County Sheriff's Department. I want to sincerely thank each of these departments, especially the Green Bay Police Department, for making this a priority and conducting a very thorough investigation. I also want to thank the Department of Justice and the Crime Lab for their professionalism and expeditious analysis of the firearms and ballistics involved in this case, which has allowed us to provide this information to you as early as today. I also want to thank the Milwaukee Medical Examiner's Office for their work to provide us with autopsy diagnosis, and to the Wisconsin State Patrol for the mapping that you will see shortly and all the work that they did. Because integrity and transparency is so important, I believe the Appleton Police Department, as they previously indicated, is prepared to make available public records later this afternoon. At this time, the only information we are missing are the final toxicology results from Mr. Houston, as those results often take weeks to test and analyze. However, the information would not affect my legal analysis regarding the criminal charges. When conducting a legal analysis of this case, there is no one recording, interview, or piece of evidence that answers all the questions related to this incident. Rather, it is necessary to review the entire investigation with all the reports, interviews, evidence, videos, 911 calls, and diagrams to understand the events of that evening, which I have done over the last week. I also conducted a review of the Wisconsin law relating to the exercise of the privilege of self-defense and the defense of others. After consideration of all available evidence and assessment of applicable legal rules and principles, I conclude that Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen acted in an objectively reasonable manner and were justified in their use of deadly force based upon their perceived threat of imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves and others by Reuben Houston. Thus, no criminal charges will be issued against either officer. I have examined and applied Wisconsin law relating to the exercise of the privilege of self-defense and defense of others as set forth in Wisconsin Statute 939.45 and 939.48, as well as the Wisconsin jury instructions and relevant Wisconsin and federal case law addressing affirmative defense of self-defense and deadly force. My determination today only relates to criminal charges, as I would not be able to overcome the affirmative defense of self-defense or defense of others available in a criminal trial against a person who uses deadly force. For the reasons I will set forth, if charges were issued, the state would not be able to overcome that affirmative defense beyond a reasonable doubt, which is our responsibility as prosecutors at trial. The use of deadly force is an affirmative defense to homicide. A person lawfully engaged in self-defense or defense of others is privileged under Wisconsin law to utilize deadly force under certain specified circumstances. The Wisconsin jury instructions, which define the privilege, direct that the reasonableness of the officer's actions be judged from the standpoint of an ordinary, prudent, and reasonably intelligent person in the officer's position, having the knowledge and training that the officers possessed, and acting under the circumstances that existed at that time. That means that we may consider the information available to the officers at the time they made their decision to use deadly force, and any circumstances about which they were unaware would be irrelevant. It also means that the fact the officers have received specialized training that is not typically available to the average citizen is a relevant consideration. I will summarize the significant factual evidence and analysis which we applied to those facts in an effort to explain how I arrived at that opinion. It is important to recognize that the video captured from the officers' body cameras does not capture what the officers were seeing because, unlike stationary video cameras, These devices are affixed to the officers' uniforms, and the officers are in constant motion, bent down, and taking cover. No camera captured a clear view of the officers' observations of Mr. Houston. In addition, the Axon body cameras are very sensitive to noise and movements. When reviewing the video, there are times when the recording sounds as if shots are being fired, but the sounds are actually attributed to the officers' movements and voice. Now, if you will give me one moment, I'd like to this video that you see is something created by the Wisconsin State Patrol after the area has already essentially been cleared of people. In that, you'll see that it's a depiction of the transit center, which you can see right here on the left. You see the Lamers bus parked right in front of the transit center, and you see the library in the bottom right corner. This is a 360 video. You can see the Appleton Fire Department fire truck parked right in the parking lot where it was originally parked by Firefighter Lundgaard. You see a squad nearby, which was not there at the time of the shooting. And you see another squad parked by the transit that was also not there at the time of the shooting. You'll note in this depiction, this area or an island in the parking structure becomes a very important location, as that is the location where Mr. Houston ultimately was, where officers arrested him, and where Brittany Showalter was when she received her injuries. In the bottom island, you'll see this is a point where Sergeant Bees was, and we're going to come back to that conversation as well. As you can see, this video gives you an idea of the location of the buildings as well as where important items were located, such as the bus, the fire truck, as well as the layout of the side of the library. I next want to show you another document that was created to help us tell the story of what happened that day. Now, as we get to that story, the beginning of the story starts in Wausau that morning. There is a Lamers bus that is a bus that goes from Wausau to Milwaukee and stops at various locations along the way. The bus stops in Milwaukee for a couple hours to allow for the bus driver to be able to get off of the bus, take a break from driving, and then be able to eat lunch and get back on the bus. Mr. Houston got on the bus in Wausau or in Rothschild and took the bus down to Milwaukee. He was dressed in what I would call business clothes and stopped in Milwaukee for a while and took care of some type of business. When he came back, he got back on the bus, which was unusual, as the bus driver says a lot of people don't get back on the same day, so he noted Mr. Houston. At that time, when Mr. Houston got back on the bus, he asked the bus driver if he could go back or get his bag and go back and change. When he went back to change, he put a Aaron Rodgers Packer football jersey on, as well as a pair of white pants. They then continue up to the Appleton area and stop in Fond du Lac first. When they stop in Fond du Lac, the individuals get off the bus. Ruben ends up going out, and he's pacing back and forth at the Fond du Lac bus stop and seems to be rather anxious according to passengers. Ultimately, he gets back on the bus, and he's helpful to the bus driver in the sense that there was another passenger on the bus who had gotten off to get a sandwich and wasn't on the bus yet. He told the bus driver that so that they could wait for her in order to be able to allow her to get back on the bus and continue her travels. The bus driver indicated ultimately they left Fond du Lac, and passengers on the bus noticed that Mr. Houston had gotten up at one point to go to the bathroom. He went to the bathroom, he came back, and everything seemed fine. Shortly thereafter, he was snoring for a while, and passengers observed that he was what they thought was sleeping. When he gets back to gets into Appleton, passengers are recognizing that his breathing and his snoring seem unusual to them. When they pull in at the transit center, they make contact with him because he's one of the only people that never gets up to move out of his seat. When passengers go to try to wake him up or to just say, hey, we're stopped in Appleton, he doesn't respond, but he continues to snore and breathe loudly, but not often. At that point in time, when they try to wake him and he doesn't respond, one of the passengers believes he's having a seizure, and a call is made to 911. In addition, the bus driver is helping someone with a handicap off the back of the bus using the handicap facilities, and a passenger comes over to him and indicates there's someone on the bus who seems to be having a seizure. At the same time, the security officer at the transit center also comes on board because he's been apprised of the same information. Shortly thereafter, Sergeant Bees, who had been on a previous call, was on his way to get gas and had heard the medical call out and decided to stop there as he knew paramedics and fire were also responding. The fire department gets there first, and Firefighter Lundgaard was driving the fire truck, goes to park the fire truck in the library parking lot, and then the other two firefighters get off the rig, come onto the bus with their medic bags in order to start rendering aid while he's parking. The firefighters make contact with him. They observe that he is what they call agonal breathing, and he also has dilated pupils that are the size of like a pinpoint, and they also notice that his breathing is very labored and very inconsistent. When they observe that, that to them is a sign of an overdose. They try to do a chest rub on him to see if that in fact wakes him up, and it does not. At that point, they begin administering oxygen to aid in his breathing, at which time the paramedic also arrives, and they identify that this is an overdose situation, and they go and prepare to administer Narcan. Now, Narcan is a drug that is available to reverse an opioid crisis or reverse that opioid overdose. Now, in order to better understand that, the Narcan is temporary. So when you take an opiate, it's common for people to get a prescription that may last somebody 12 hours. And maybe you take that drug every 12 hours, you take it first, it releases that first dose, and then the drug is designed to have a second release of that dose later on during that 12-hour period. Now, Mr. Houston, we didn't know what he had taken at that point in time, but because of what they showed, they tried to administer the Narcan. The first dose was able to allow him to start breathing easier, and then the second dose they gave him helped him in order to be able to come conscious again, because that first dose didn't make him conscious. Once he comes to, Narcan is almost like a light switch. So when you give that to somebody, that person instantly responds and instantly can come to. Mr. Houston did that, which is a sign that that was an opiate overdose, and was able to recognize, in fact, that he was in the Appleton area and knew where he was. Officers begin talking to him and ask him what he took, and he indicated that he had taken some of his wife's morphine. I think he specifically stated he took 4 of them. What we know coming back to that opiate is that when you give that, and it may be a 12-hour duration, that Narcan that was given only has the ability to do that rescue for about an hour. If I was given Narcan right now, it would have no impact on me because I don't have an opiate on board. But when you do, it instantly responds. But it only is able to provide that rescue for approximately an hour. Why that's important is because the paramedics and the fire department firefighters were concerned about his safety and were concerned about whether or not he would overdose again. Because he continued to have that long-acting opiate on board, they were afraid that he would have to be Narcaned again or be given Narcan in an hour or so later because of the amount of morphine he had. The reason that's so important is because they want him to go to the hospital to get medically cleared and make sure he's okay so he doesn't overdose again. They explain that to Reuben Houston, and ultimately Reuben exits the vehicle or exits the bus, is able to easily on his own walk out of the bus, walk down the steps, and go outside. At which point Firefighter Lundgaard had a cot available right outside the door where Reuben briefly sat for a moment. At that point, Sergeant Bees was also there. He also was observing because, again, this was a medical call. This was not a criminal call, so he was just there as an assist to the paramedics and fire. And he asked Houston if he could pat him down to make sure that he didn't have any needles or anything else that would be unsafe that would risk paramedics or firefighters. Now that's important because when he goes forward to ask Mr. Houston if he could pat him down, Mr. Houston kind of swats his hands away and kind of steps back. And he indicates that his legs are bothering him, and that's why he took the morphine. So he starts walking around and kind of moving his legs, saying that his legs were bothering him. At the same time, he kind of stretches, he kind of moves around. All the paramedics, the firefighters, and Sergeant Bees who were there at the time were extremely professional, which I think you will be able to view of these videos, and were very compassionate in terms of wanting him to seek the medical care he needed and trying to explain that. Because Mr. Houston kept saying, he said, I did an overdose, I'm fine, there was no need to have the medical intervention, but they knew otherwise, and they wanted to try to make sure that he got that help. At one point, because he didn't want to be searched, he didn't want to go to the hospital, he indicated that he needed to go home to Wausau because he needed to pay his rent and he needed to see his wife. His wife had some health problems and had been in the hospital that Tuesday and again that Wednesday, and he wanted to return to Wausau in order to be able to go back to her. So he didn't want to go to the hospital because he didn't want to miss the bus and he didn't want to miss a delay in getting back home. Sergeant Bees is still concerned about what to do at that point because he's not sure, it's not a criminal case, but there's that concern about his safety and whether Reuben's making choices that are going to be in his best interest or if he's risking his life and putting himself in danger by not going to the hospital. So Sergeant Bees then contacts his lieutenant in order to be able to have a conversation about that. In order to say, is this a case where we should put him or try to call Allegheny County Crisis and place him on a Chapter 51 or 55 hold because he's a risk to himself? Or is this a situation where, we try to just talk to him, encourage him? During this time, the conversation among all of them seems to be very calm. According to all of the witnesses, it seems to be very conversational. It seems to be very explaining in order to educate Mr. Houston on why he needs to go to the hospital. He again continues to reiterate he doesn't. Well, Sergeant Bees is having that conversation with his lieutenant. Officer Christensen arrives on scene because he hears the dispatch and he's available to also respond and provide additional assistance. He also comes to that area. And when he comes to the area, he stands by the officers, the paramedics and the firefighters as they're continuing to talk to them. Now, also an important thing is there's a woman at the transit center who helps with their operations, and there's also the bus driver there. They're indicating to Mr. Houston that he can't get back on that bus and go to Wausau because they can't take on that liability of having him have an overdose when they're, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour outside of Appleton, and that they really want him to get that medical attention to make sure that he's okay. So at the same time that everyone's encouraging him to go to the hospital, you also have a situation where the bus administrator and the bus driver are telling him he can't get back on the bus. So Officer Christensen is listening to that conversation as well, again, as an assist to this medical call. Sergeant Bees then comes over and comes back, which is where we want to, again, look at this scene. Now you'll see right here where I'm pointing is the corner of the bus where the conversation ensued. So right here is where the cot is. Right here is where the ambulance is. And they're having that conversation, and when Sergeant Bees goes to have the conversation with his lieutenant, he goes and he stands over by the ambulance, which was right here. So, Officer Christensen is also here, as is everybody else. Now, this is where, when Sergeant Christensen comes back, he has a conversation now with Mr. Houston about the fact that he needs to go to the hospital. And if he doesn't go to the hospital, they may have to do a Chapter 51 or 55 mental health hold in order to make sure that he's okay. Sergeant Christensen is observing, as all officers do, with their great observation skills, and is trying to watch his behavior and his demeanor at that point, okay? Which is different from before. So they start talking again about patting him down and frisking him, and Mr. Houston does not want that. They had asked a number of times. He did not want to be searched. At one point, he takes items out of his pocket, which was like a phone charger and some other miscellaneous items, and puts them on the ground to show he doesn't have anything, but he doesn't want the officers touching him. At the point in time that Officer Christensen is there, he walks around, because what Mr. Houston had done is he had positioned himself in a way that his right hip was up against the front of the bus. So anybody that was having contact with him was looking at him from a left side angle, and he was walking around in that way. On the video, it doesn't seem unordinary. It doesn't seem concerning. In hindsight, when we look back and we know what he has, we become aware differently. When Officer Christensen comes around from the back of the bus, he essentially goes around the front in order to try to see what's on that right hip. Now keep in mind, he has a large Packer jersey on, so there's nothing that stands out, really. He asks Mr. Houston to lift up his shirt to make sure that he doesn't have anything. And at that point, Mr. Houston starts to step back more. He starts to put his right arm over towards the right area of his pocket. And Officer Christensen tells him to remove his hands from the area and not touch anything. At that point in time, they're still trying to talk to him. Sergeant Bees, who is CIT trained, which is a specific crisis intervention training, which helps people de-escalate when they're getting upset, is actively using all of these skills, and Officer Christensen is actively using interpersonal skills to communicate with him at that point in time, because he's starting to get agitated. When he puts his hand on the hip, within seconds, he removes a small .380, or a small .38. When he pulls that gun is essentially the size of the front part of your hand or your fingers. It is a very small weapon. Mr. Houston had that located in a Velcro case on his hip next to a cell phone, and it looked like a cell phone case. It did not look like a holster. It did not look like an item that you would put a gun in, but rather it was small. When you looked at it, if you were to just observe by him lifting up his shirt, which he didn't do, but if you would have, what you would have seen is something that many people would identify as a multi-tool case. But he pulls out a small .380, begins to rack it in front of him, at which point, right here on the corner of the bus, you have 3 firemen, 2 paramedics, the security officer at the transit center, the bus driver who is just in the bus, in the driver's seat, but in that same line. You also have the woman who works for the bus from the transit center standing there, and you have the 2 officers. All of those people are there, at which point Houston stands back, racks his gun, and indexes it, and immediately shoots 2 times. Officer Christensen also responded instantaneously from the location that he was, where he also grabbed his duty weapon, he indexed it, and he shot. Mr. Houston shot probably a millisecond or 2 ahead of Officer Christensen, but almost exactly simultaneously. At that point in time, Houston is walking backwards towards the library. And at that point in time, all of the individuals there are starting to scatter in order to find cover. When Mr. Houston shoots, those two right in front of the bus, he shoots both Officer Christensen and Firefighter Lundgaard. Those two shots were directly from the location where he was, aimed directly towards a transit center and where all of those people were standing. Firefighter Lundgaard, as others had tried to move and escape, began to turn his back, crouch down a little bit for cover, bend, and start to run, at which point he had a bullet wound to his back, mid part of his upper back, that went through all the way through his chest and out the front on the left-hand side. That was the fatal shot and singular shot that killed Firefighter Lundgaard. The other shot was a shot to Officer Bees, who received a shot in the lower area of his body, was able to also immediately take cover and be able to run down the side of the bus and find cover right in the area in the alcove where the door is. Officer Christensen had shot once at that front of the bus to Mr. Houston, which we believe was a shot to his abdomen, which was ultimately the lethal shot that killed Mr. Houston. However, Mr. Houston did not die of that shot immediately, and the incident continued. When Officer Christensen gets to this area, he calls out that he sees a firefighter down on the radio. Simultaneously, he's watching because Sergeant Bees is running around the bus to the other side, where you're able to see in the middle of the road, he takes a tumble, he falls, he gets back up from the middle of the road, and he finds a location right on an island right by near the fire truck behind a tree. When Sergeant Bees goes down in the middle of the road, Officer Christensen thinks that Officer Bees might have been shot because he goes right down in front of him. But then he pops back up, Sergeant Bees does, and he finds cover behind that tree. Sergeant Bees was also shooting at this point because Houston had come over to this island that I explained earlier by the library, and that Brittany Showalter had been sitting there with a number of other individuals. And what's really important to note is the transit center at that time of day is very busy. There are buses dropping people off, there's cars driving up and down the road. There are people, there was a city council meeting that night, so there were people that were parking in there to walk to the city council meeting. There were people going to the library, and there were people milling about. It was a beautiful day. So there were a lot of people in that area, and Brittany was one of those. And she was with others that she was talking to right over here by the tree. When Mr. Houston, after he shoots those two shots in front of the bus that hit Officer Christensen and Officer Christensen and Firefighter Lundgaard, he then runs to the area where Brittany is. He puts his arm around her neck and essentially uses her like a human shield. When he does that, she is now in the way of trying to end that threat because he's still shooting. These red dots are casings that are from his gun. So he's still shooting, and meanwhile, Officer Christensen is standing in the door, and he's also shooting because he sees that there is a citizen who has now been taken hostage and who's being used as that shield. Sergeant Bees finds cover behind the tree. He also is shooting, and he is yelling commands at Houston to drop the gun and to stop firing. He doesn't do that. He doesn't follow direction, and he keeps shooting. Now, from this time, we know that Mr. Houston shot 5 times. We know that Officer Christensen shot 8 times, and we know that Sergeant Christensen shot 11 times. We know there was one casing that was ultimately from this area, that's not on this map, that had landed on the cot that the paramedic wiped away to put Firefighter Lundgaard on, that eventually was found located in one of the firefighters' medic bags. The other 7 are located down by the other ones are located right exactly where he was. Now, I can't underestimate and can't tell you what bravery Officer Christensen showed despite his very serious, very painful injury. He continued to engage in trying to address the threat. He continued to watch for citizens in the area. He continued to monitor the well-being of the officer that he was partnered with on that call in order to keep trying to address it. In fact, even after that, when he was able to find cover behind the Appleton squad car that arrived here moments later, he walked over to that area still with his weapon drawn, still trying to protect people and still trying to provide that cover should Mr. Houston continue to shoot, because he was still in that area, moving wildly. As other witnesses were interviewed, they talked about how Mr. Houston was laying there, but he still was moving his arms around wildly and waving the gun in the air. People didn't know how many bullets he had in his gun or how many he had, but they continued to be very concerned about the safety of the well-being of everyone there when they saw that he was behaving so wildly. Ultimately, when coming back to Officer Christensen, he walks over to that squad car, still actively engaged in his duties to protect our community, at which point officers are able to determine that he's injured and encourage him to come with them so that they can quickly get him to the hospital to be checked out. Now, Sergeant Christensen is still engaged in talking to Mr. Houston and trying to get him to put his hands behind his back and trying to get him to put the gun down or to get rid of it, but he can't see that gun. So Sergeant Christensen then moves to a location behind the truck over here parked in the library in order to get a better view of what happened with the citizen and how to get her away, because he's directing her to try to move, but she's not moving. She's not moving away. Ultimately, then, he comes back to the Appleton squad car, and somebody has arrived with a shield. He is able to grab that shield and with another officer able to approach Mr. Houston, make contact with him with the shield, and able to, at that point in time, try to place him under arrest. Now, that took a couple of minutes, and it took a number of officers. Mr. Houston, at that point, was significantly injured, and he also was still somewhat combative at that point, or was combative at that point, and not following the directions of officers. So once officers got there, as soon as one was available to get to Brittany Showalter, that officer pulled Brittany Showalter back into this area behind behind the Appleton squad car, where they had called another paramedic or ambulance to arrive and immediately began rendering aid. Brittany Showalter received an injury to the upper portion of her leg, and she also received a shot to the head. What likely happened is when Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen were shooting, because of the way Mr. Houston positioned her, it is likely that she got hit by one of the officer's shots. However, we don't know that and won't know that because there's no DNA that the crime lab was able to get that would be able to indicate to us what that injury or how that injury came about in terms of whose gun it was. The injury that she had grazed the top of her head enough to hit her skull and cause a traumatic brain harm or traumatic brain injury, where she did have to receive surgery to be cared for, but she was able, it did not penetrate her skull or cause further damage. After Brittany is able to be rescued and pulled to safety, and officers are placing Mr. Houston under arrest, they ultimately find the weapon underneath him, which again is the small .380. They place him under arrest, and at that point in time, an ambulance, once the scene is secure and he is cuffed, an ambulance is there and begins rendering aid to him. Ultimately, he dies at the Theda Clark Hospital down in Neenah after the incident had occurred as a result of the injuries. He had injuries to his arm, both of his arms, to his fingers, the one to his abdomen, and then had both of his fingers injured where he was likely holding his gun at that time. The valiant efforts of both Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen cannot be underestimated in the sense that while this was an extreme tragedy and loss of life with Firefighter Lundgaard, and while this was an extreme significant injury for both Officer Christensen and for Brittany Showalter, it is amazing, and other witnesses there also said the same thing, that it's surprising that nobody else got hurt or killed as a result of the gunfire and the behavior of Mr. Houston. Now, turning back to the analysis that we are here to talk about today, there is no question the officers intentionally shot and killed Reuben Houston on May 15, 2019. Wisconsin acknowledges privilege as a defense to otherwise criminal conduct where a privilege by statute, in this case self-defense or defense of others, exists. That can be found in Wisconsin Statute 939-45 sub 6 and 939-48 sub 1 and sub 4. Specifically, 939.48 sub 1 reads, "A person is privileged to threaten or intentionally use force against another for the purpose of preventing or terminating what the person reasonably believes to be an unlawful interference with his or her person by such other person. The actor may intentionally use only such force or threat thereof as the actor reasonably believes is necessary to prevent or terminate the interference. The actor may not intentionally use force which is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm unless the actor reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself." Sergeant Bees and Officer Christian saw Mr. Houston rack and point a gun in the direction of them, firefighters, paramedics, other civilians, and then fire his gun numerous times. They also witnessed Firefighter Lundgaard go down, and Officer Christensen had been shot. Because of these facts and supporting evidence, any criminal charge against them would be met with the affirmative defense. A jury would be instructed after the elements of the crime and before reaching a conclusion of guilt on the privilege of self-defense. The jurors would be instructed that the law of self-defense allows a person, the defendant, to use intentional force against another if he believed there was an actual or imminent unlawful interference with his person, that the amount of force used was necessary to prevent and terminate the interference, and those beliefs were reasonable. The jurors would also be instructed that a defendant may intentionally use force intended to cause death or great bodily harm only if he reasonably believed that the force used was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or to others. The jury instruction defines reasonable beliefs as the following. A belief may be reasonable even though mistaken. The standard is what a person of ordinary intelligence and prudence would have believed in the defendant's position under the circumstances that existed at the time of the alleged offense. The reasonableness of the defendant's belief must be determined from the standpoint of the defendant at the time of the defendant's acts and not from the viewpoint of the jury at the time of trial. The jury is further instructed to consider not only what a reasonable person would have believed, but to make this determination from the standpoint of the person charged. The state then is required to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that a defendant did not act in lawful self-defense. The jury is instructed to find a defendant not guilty if they find he acted in self-defense if the state has not disproved the defense by a reasonable doubt, or beyond a reasonable doubt. The United States Supreme Court says that in judging the reasonableness of a particular use of force, the focus must be, quote, from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision in hindsight. The law recognizes that officers are forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. The standard is that officers are trained that an imminent threat is an immediate threat, or a threat about to happen. To be considered imminent, a threat has to meet 3 criteria. The subject must indicate his intent to cause great bodily harm or death to you or someone else. In this particular case, officers saw Mr. Houston rack a gun and pointed at their direction where they were standing near paramedics, firefighters, and civilians. They saw Mr. Houston shoot towards them. Officers were aware it was early evening and the transit center and library were busy with people walking around. They observed cars driving up and down the street and buses arriving at the transit center. Officer Christensen was shot and injured as he ran for cover. Officer Christensen and Sergeant Bees saw a firefighter go down as they continued to respond. The officers saw Houston use Brittany as a human shield and continue to shoot towards them. Houston refused to comply with their orders to put down the gun. Second, the subject must have a weapon capable of inflicting great bodily harm or death. Certainly, Mr. Houston's gun was a weapon that did in fact inflict great bodily harm to Officer Christensen and Brittany Showalter and to the death of Firefighter Lundgaard. Third, the subject must have a means of using the weapon to inflict harm, and certainly in this case, Houston used the weapon to inflict deadly harm. Officers are instructed that in many deadly force situations, they will not have time or the ability to try other options. Officers are trained that their judgment in deadly force situations is based on the totality of the circumstances known to them at the time and provides this example. If a suspect points a firearm at you with the clear intent to shoot, you are justified to use deadly force, even if the suspect's gun is later found to be unloaded. That does not render the decision unjustified, as the perception of the threat was reasonable under the circumstances at that time. In reviewing the case, I also have to use the application of law to the facts. And the questions in this case include: 1. Did the officers reasonably believe that there was an actual or imminent unlawful interference with their person or another, and was the amount of force they used necessary to prevent or terminate the interference? And my answer is yes. Second, did the officers reasonably believe that the force used was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves or others? Yes. They believed there was an imminent threat to themselves, to each other, the first responders with them on the call, and the civilians all around them. The third question, if the officers were charged with the killing of Reuben Houston, could the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer in question did not act lawfully in self-defense? And my answer is no. In conclusion, the events of the Appleton Transit Center on May 15th, 2019 were extremely tragic. We lost one of our own, and our officers were forced to make difficult decisions and risk their lives to protect our community. While these events are something that we never want to happen, I am proud and inspired by how our community has responded and come together to support each other. What started as a routine medical call quickly escalated into a very dangerous situation. The officers, firefighters, and paramedics who responded to the call responded to assist in providing medical aid to Houston and continued to be concerned for his safety and well-being up until the time he pulled the gun on them. The officers then engaged to protect themselves, fellow first responders, and the citizens near the area of the transit center that evening. Both officers risked their own lives and exemplified a high degree of training and professionalism in their response. Even when Officer Christensen experienced serious bodily injury to himself, he continued to respond to protect others. As one witness told investigators, "I don't know how more people were not injured or killed. I do." It's because of the heroic bravery of Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen, who saw the threat and had to quickly respond, and Officer Christian, who through great adversity continued to protect others so more life was not lost. Certainly this is something they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. The week of May 15th was National Law Enforcement Week, where the country pays tribute to the men and women who protect us in our communities and honor those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. The pain of losing Firefighter Lundgaard will continue to weigh on the hearts and minds of the community and the Appleton Police and Fire Departments, but the actions of our law enforcement in this tragedy are commendable. I am proud to serve in a county with such highly trained, professional members of law enforcement. My appreciation goes out to each of them for protecting us every day and putting their lives on the line. When faced with great adversity or tragedy, it is the coming together to support each other that makes us strong and helps us weather the storm. Over the last 4 weeks, our community has shown great empathy, love, and understanding. As we continue to remember Firefighter Lundgaard, I urge people to honor his life of service to others, whether it was his community, co-workers, family, or friends. Again, my deepest sympathies to the family and friends of Firefighter Lundgaard and his brothers and sisters at the Appleton Fire Department. His sense of humor, the way he would help his family, a friend, a co-worker, and the incredible service he gave to the city of Appleton will live on in all of them. Thank you.
Make a brief statement and then we'll take some questions. I want to start off by offering our condolences to the Lundgaard family. Obviously, they continue to be in our thoughts and prayers along with all the firefighters that have been affected and the police officers. This tragedy has forever changed the lives of many people, most importantly, those of the Lundgaard family. We know there's nothing that we can do to take away the pain, but as a community, we can continue to support them and stay committed to responding to this the way that Mitch would want us to. We thank the Green Bay Police Department for their quick response and timely investigation. We know that this is a very difficult case for them to investigate. Their staff was extremely compassionate and professional. We also thank the special agents of the Wisconsin Department of Criminal Investigation who immediately responded to the scene. I also want to thank the Wisconsin State Patrol for the help they provided that evening and for the work they did reconstructing a very complex crime scene, as you saw. Investigation like this is never done alone. It takes several local and state agencies working together to ensure an investigation is complete and thorough. It's also impossible to name all the agencies that assisted us at the scene and in the days that followed. But I do want to specifically thank Outagamie County Sheriff Krewald and Chief Greg Peterson of the Grand Chute Police Department for the amazing assistance their agencies provided at the time of the incident and for providing police services to the city of Appleton during the procession and the funeral. The Appleton Police and Fire Departments, our employees and our families are eternally grateful for all the help provided to us during our toughest days. As a community, we need to thank District Attorney Templis and her staff for making their review of this incident a priority. We know how important it is to provide accurate information to the public as quickly as possible, but it can never be at the expense of the integrity of the investigation. And we are thankful for our dispatchers, who are lifelines during incidents like this and who never get the credit that they deserve. Thank you for your dedication and your sacrifice. I've read the reports and reviewed the body camera videos. The body cameras, again, proved to be extremely valuable and well worth the investment that we make in them. Our body camera program protects our officers from false accusations, helps us to gather critical evidence, and strengthens the trust that the community has in us. And for this incident, it shows the public just how a seemingly insignificant, non-emergency call for service can quickly turn deadly. I'm extremely proud of the professionalism that all the first responders displayed. Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen were extremely patient and compassionate to a person who they were genuinely concerned for, and in a split second, that person turned on them. They courageously responded in a way that they have been trained to stop a deadly threat. These officers and the others that responded then provided medical aid to the same person who just seconds before was trying to kill them. Sergeant Bees and Officer Christensen responded heroically, moving and repeatedly engaging the suspect as he fired. Even after Officer Christensen was hit and clearly in extreme pain, he battled on because he knew people's lives were still in danger. They were both guardians and caregivers, and when needed, they were true warriors, vividly demonstrating what we know as the thin blue line. Officers also provided emergency medical aid to Ms. Showalter, which included driving the rescue squad to the hospital so that the EMTs could provide her the critical care that she needed to survive. We ask the community to keep her in your thoughts and prayers as she continues to recover from this tragedy. The body camera videos will be released, will allow you to see and feel how this incident developed. It puts you in the shoes of the officers involved. They are very intense and difficult videos to watch. But there's also a video that shows the exact moment that the officers working the scene learned that Mitch had died. It's heart-wrenching and painful to watch. But the officers' actions after that again demonstrated what is meant when you hear the words, the thin blue line, or the thin red line. On the video, you will see the immediate shock they feel. How everyone takes a breath, pauses for a couple seconds, and they jump right back into getting things done and working the investigation. That's what your officers and firefighters do every day. I could not be prouder of the performance from both the departments. So as we continue to heal from this, what have we learned about our community? Obviously, this was an anomaly for our community, for any community. This could have happened anywhere on the bus route from Milwaukee to Wausau. This was a criminal traveling through our community who had a long history of illegal and dangerous behavior. His actions were pure evil. But it is the actions of those first responders and how this community supported us which reaffirms everything we already know about Appleton, and I think that's what's going to be the final word in this tragedy. Fire Chief and I previously mentioned some of the things that we witnessed that displayed valor to us, but there were many more. On the videos you will see heroic, compassionate, and selfless acts from all the first responders, which is only part of the story. It is how this community responded with love, understanding, empathy, and even tears that is as important as anything else. In Appleton, we know who we are as a community and why we are always hopeful. It's because of those children that dropped off cards and collected money for the families. It's that young girls softball team who went out and asked for donations so they could have a cookout with the firefighters and the police officers. It's the countless messages of support and prayers that came from all parts of our diverse community. It's all the hugs we received from community members, including the media, and our fellow brothers and sisters in public service who encourage us to keep fighting on. It's that amazing turnout for Mitch's procession and funeral, and the beautiful signs and support shown by the tens of thousands of people who line that route. In the end, it is the actions of all those people, our heroic first responders and our compassionate community members, that truly define the city of Appleton. And with that, the DA and I will take some questions.
Can you just clarify, I think, the number of shots everybody fired? I think you said Christensen.
Sure. Let me just, if we go back to this area, what you can see here, the blue dots on this map are the dots of the 9mm bullet casings that are from the Appleton Police Department weapons. Now, when the casings come out, they pop off to the side. So while you see a location on there, that doesn't specifically say that that was the spot they were standing at the time, because they're casings. And during all the activity, some of these casings got moved around. Officer Christensen shot one up in the top near the front of the bus. That's the one that ultimately was on the cot and ended up in one of the fire department bags during transport. So that's not on this picture. The other 7 are located right in that alcove area entering into the transit center. The blue ones that you see between the Lamers bus and the Appleton squad, keeping in mind that that Appleton squad was not there at the time of the shooting but came after, those were from Sergeant B's, and there are 11 that he fired. Then you see the 5 red dots. Those are the casings that are from Reuben Houston's gun and indicate his shots.
And so Christensen shot cover in that doorway. Bees was the one that was behind the squad and got the shield.
The squad.
That's why
I'm sorry, maybe I misspoke at the
Yeah.
time. So what happened is that Sergeant B's was in the middle. Officer Christensen is in the transit alcove. Sergeant B's comes to the center. Now that squad car was not there, right? So he still is trying to engage Mr. Houston at that time, who's still shooting, and he's shooting back trying to protect others while he is trying to get to cover on the other side behind a tree. The tree is located just to the right of where that fire truck was. So where you see a cluster of those casings is probably where those casings were probably from when he was standing behind the tree. The ones in the middle are at the point where he runs around from the front of the bus to the back. He's in the middle of the street. He falls for a second, but he's shooting, and he has his eye on Houston as Houston is continuing to shoot from the center.
And the Showalter injuries were definitely officer fight. There wasn't DNA, so you just don't know which officer that.
I don't know where her injuries came from. It is likely that they came from one of the officers, but we will never know. It is possible they came from Mr. Houston. I'm inclined to think it's more likely they came from the officers because he was using her as a human shield. And as you think about it, it's a very active situation and people are moving. So if he's shooting and he's grabbing her and moving her with, she becomes then in the line of fire.
What's what's their training in a situation like that? What are they trained to do?
Much like the active shooter trainings that a lot of you have done stories on, similar to if you would go into a school or a workplace, something called the greater danger theory, where an officer has to make a split-second decision on whether it's more likely that somebody may be injured if they don't act than if they act. So if somebody is holding someone hostage or threatening someone with a firearm, or in a school doing a shooting, the officer has to make that split-second decision on whether it's more dangerous for them to try to engage and stop that threat or allow that person to act and then respond. And if we wait until they act, it's too late.
What is her condition exactly? I know you said brain injury, but what did she all lose in this?
At the point in time of the information I have, she was recovering from her surgery and seeming to do well. I don't have a further update than that.
Does this incident change the protocol in any way of how you respond to an overdose? Whether you check them for weapons before you render aid?
That's an excellent question. There have been a lot of conversations among law enforcement across the state of Wisconsin and quite honestly the country and how to respond to these with the opiate epidemic that we're seeing. And recently, I think it was last year or not that long before that, there was an officer who had overdosed just from responding to a scene and having to be Narcan and taken in for medical care in the Fox Valley. So that changed how we handle things, right? This is another one of those situations where there are conversations going on at the Training and Standards Bureau, at the Department of Justice, with criminal litigation at the Department of Justice, within our office and DA's offices across the state, where what are the legal options available to officers? Because in this call, remember, what's so important to remember is this was a medical call. This was a render aid to a civilian. This was not a criminal investigation. So there wasn't that need to, search him because they're trying to render aid to him. I anticipate moving forward there will be changes to policy and there'll be discussions about doing a search of the person or their lunge area to ensure that the firefighters, the paramedics, and the police are safe when responding to an overdose call, because it is not uncommon that there are weapons when we have drugs involved. I heard recently that shortly thereafter somebody else in the state had responded to an overdose. They did the pat down specifically because of the incident that happened here, and a 9mm gun was located on them before they were able to render aid. So it is critical that we have those conversations in order to keep our first responders safe. So I anticipate there'll be continued conversation about that moving forward.
Chief, how are the officers doing? And obviously Christensen suffered the more severe injury, and now that the investigation is complete, what will their status be with the department?
Sure, we'll follow our policy as far as returning them to duty. Officer Christensen is recovering as well as can be expected, so we will work with his medical provider. We have a process where we'll do a critical incident review. Our use force team will review it, make sure everything operated under policy and state statute, and then we'll bring the officers back when appropriate and when they're ready.
His injury was what again, Officer Christensen?
Lower extremities, upper legs area.
Could Houston's violent behavior afterward be a result of the Narcan?
No.
We saw in the calls that someone says, would you look up calls from yesterday talking to our friend? Apparently we dealt with this subject for some similar issues. Were there any other issues?
He was not from our area. He never had resided in Appleton that we're aware of, so our local law enforcement hadn't had any contact with him.
And besides the gunshot wound to the abdomen, were they gunshot wounds to the hands and arms?
Yes.
As opposed to all, they were
As opposed to?
as falling and.
Oh, no, they were gunshot
okay.
wounds, yes.
Going back to the Narcan question, other law enforcement members have said that Narcan takes people away from their high that they have instantly,
Yes.
which sometimes angers them. I mean, is that, it's not a physical result of Narcan, but is that kind of an emotional or result of coming down from a high that quickly?
It can. That is a response that some people get. So sometimes because somebody is on a high, of an opiate and you give them Narcan and they immediately come back down, sometimes people get agitated. I would say that from reviewing all the video that I had, Mr. Houston was appropriately engaged on the bus. He was having appropriate conversations and was respectful while he was outside of the bus, and that didn't seem to be a situation that we had in this case. It was specific choices that he was making in terms of his behavior.
When Mr. Houston was walking, when he drew his firearm, was he walking away from the officers? Were they approaching him? Where was his position again?
He was in front of the bus, more towards the driver's side, and he began to step backwards. And then when he indexed the gun, he pulled it and was facing towards the transit center, towards where all of the first responders were standing, and walking backwards as he did his 2 shots there that hit both Officer Christensen and Firefighter Lundgaard.
And you said that initially officers didn't know how many bullets or weapons he had after the fact. I mean, how many rounds did he have on his
He
gun?
spent all 5. That's all he had, but he spent all of them. But they wouldn't have known what he had at that time.
You kept on, you kind of went back and forth, and I want to just make sure we clarify. You said it was a 38 or a 380?
It was a 380.
380 5-shot revolver.
Yes.
Okay.
Not a revolver.
Oh, I'm sorry. Not a revolver.
Okay.
Semi-automatic.
Okay.
I'll rely on my police friends for that clarification.
380 semi-auto. Of course. Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you very much.